Hi, everybody. This is SAAD for the SAAD Truth. Finally, after a roughly 3 months delay, and I'll explain why there's been this delay, I have with me here James Damore. I think most of you, certainly those who would watch this show, would know who he is. But before I explain why we've had the delay, hi, James. How are you?
Doing good.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Maybe you could very, very briefly, for the three people in North America who haven't yet heard of your story, just give us a summary and then we'll take it from there.
All right. So I worked at Google for about 4 years, and then I started seeing some problems with my team, inclusion, and maybe some people weren't speaking up. So I decided to go to these diversity and inclusion meetings. And in it, we talked about just how to balance the demographics of Google and make it more representative of the population. And they were presenting ideas of basically just discriminating against certain people to get others into Google. And they were saying that the only reason why we didn't have 50% women at Google was sexism. And yeah, I really felt like they were missing out on some ways that we could change Google to make it more amenable to women, to make it so that we can organically increase the number of women rather than just discriminate against people. And so I wrote this document, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, where I went about describing how we have a huge political bias at Google, which means that we only think about sexism and racism as explanations for disparities in the population rather than any other possible explanation. And so I went about describing some of the differences in personality between men and women and how that might be relevant in the workplace and how we could change the workplace to make it more amenable to women. And they didn't like this. There was a lot of outrage within the company. It got leaked. Then there was a ton of external PR pressure on Google, and then they fired me for perpetuating gender stereotypes.
There you go. Well, thank you for that succinct summary. So I thought that maybe now I could just very briefly talk about why it is that we're holding the conversation now rather than, I think it was the evening of August 8th turning to August 7th turning to August 8th. And the reason why I say turning is because at the time I was in California, which is 3 hours behind. And so the stamp of when I made the clip, which was released today, where I gave my opinion of the thing, said August 8th, but I think I actually made it August 7th Pacific time. Now, we had spoken or emailed back and forth that day before you had really gone public and started your sort of whole media circuit, because you were coming on my show. And of course, I was very pleased to have you come on, and you were very gracious to accept to come on the show back then, as the story was breaking. And then, for those of you who don't know, just a few days earlier, I think maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks earlier, I had given a talk at the main campus in Mountain View on my research in evolutionary consumption, which would be very much relevant to your memo. And as I was discussing with some relevant folks the possibility that you were coming on my show, I heard from different sources, some very trustworthy sources, that if this were to happen, it would almost guarantee the fact that my talk would never be posted. My first response, being a fighter, is F them. No way. Nobody's gonna stop me. This is not. And then after pragmatism set in, I was convinced, I hope rightly so, that it was in everybody's best interest, including yours, that the talk come out. And so for about two and a half months after I had given the talk had disappeared, and the rumors on social media was that the talk would never be released. To their credit, they eventually posted it. They were very gracious in doing so. So I think in early October, about a month ago now, a few weeks ago, they posted it. And so I thought that at that point, it was opportune for us to be able to sit down. So that's the reason why we're holding this conversation today rather than a few months ago. But I guess holding it today might actually be an interesting thing to do, because now you have sort of hindsight behind you. You've had 3 months to digest all this. So I guess the first question I would ask you, the first substantive question is, and forgive me for speaking for so long, I'm trying to set up the whole thing. There's one of my former professors at Cornell, a very well-known psychologist by the name of Tom Gilovich, has done some fantastic work looking at the psychology of regret. The idea being that we could regret things for one of two reasons: either for an action, I regret the fact that I cheated on my wife and that caused the end of our marriage, versus regretting due to inaction. I regret the fact that I never pursued my dreams and didn't become a dancer. So in your case, 3 months after all that you faced, do you experience any regret, either one or the other?
I guess I regret just small things, maybe, using the term neuroticism, but I don't necessarily regret the big picture, partly just because I feel like it would be unhealthy for me to regret it. I would just be a happier person if I don't regret. So I feel like I've chosen not to.
What a very accomplished way, mentally healthy way. So what you're basically saying is that there is no functional purpose for you to regret, since the cat is out of the bag. So what's the point? But in the deep recesses of your minds, when you lay down your head on your pillow, nobody is around to. Do you say, geez, I regret all the notoriety. I had a great thing at Google, great company, great location. This was my dream job. I left my PhD, if I remember correctly, right? You left your PhD to join Google. Or are you emboldened to the contrary? I'm now someone who is very well known for having taken a principled stance. I didn't do anything wrong. So help us through that, notwithstanding the fact that you don't want to regret anything.
Yeah, so I definitely had a nice job at Google, nice benefits, nice salary. But, there are certain advantages now, people know me, and I've got to meet so many cool people. So
none more than the one you're speaking to right now.
Right. And so I feel like it's not strictly better or worse. And so I just sort of choose to shift my values to make it so that this one is better. But
wow. Clearly, you will never be seeing a therapist, because that is a profoundly healthy way of looking at things. How have the close people around you reacted to your action? In other words, did mom and dad say, "What the hell have you done, you moron? You were set," or your girlfriend, or your significant other, or your friends? What's been the general consensus from those folks to your reality?
Yeah, most of my family didn't really want me to, go into the spotlight at all. And, it's not like I was seeking out publicity or anything. I just felt like if I had stayed silent, then that would have been so much worse for the cause.
Right.
And so, they didn't want me to go public because, they just felt like they wanted to make me safe. And same with my girlfriend. But they've also been supportive, so that's good.
Now, so here, let's use some evolutionary principles, since what got you into hot trouble, it's this very controversial thing called evolution. So on the one hand, from a girlfriend perspective, you losing the job is not good for your mating trajectory. Testosterone goes down. You had a top job. You were an alpha dog at Google. But on the other hand, you're now a very well-known, a hero, someone who speaks out, a risk taker. That's very attractive. So when we weigh all these, is the girlfriend more or less into James Damore?
I'd like to think that she's more into me now.
Right. Well, if you disagree, please send me a private email. I won't share it with anybody. All right. Let's talk about where we are. I mean, I guess maybe there are some things you probably can't say if there's an ongoing process, but where are you at, whether it be legally or even unofficially? What's going on? Where are you in the process with Google right now?
Yeah, there's currently a federal case against them by the National Labor Relations Board on this and some other issues, actually, related to political discrimination and illegally firing me. So that should hopefully be resolved soon-ish.
And now how does that work? Is that through that outfit, or does it go through the court system, or is it a mediated situation? What's the mechanism for resolving this dispute with Google?
I'm not 100% sure,
Okay, okay.
actually, but I think the government actually decides some things.
I see. One of the things that I thought would be helpful in speaking today is, to reiterate the point of public engagement. I always tell people, look, you, this is a grand battle of ideas, and everybody has their voice, to lend to the story, right? Some people will eventually have huge platforms, like you came out of, if I may say, obscurity to now be very much in the spotlight. Others might only have their fellow friends on Facebook or the guys that they hang out with at the bar to engage with. But everybody has the potential to weigh in on important issues. Now, so if someone now is watching this and says, well, here's a guy who ultimately, he had to bear a huge cost, losing a fantastic job with, one of the top companies. What do you tell them? Because, and the reason I'm asking this is because I can't tell you how many emails and messages from people saying, look, I really want to heed your call. I really want to step out and speak against X, Y, and Z, but I'm afraid because I'm going to get a bad grade. I'm afraid because my girlfriend will leave me. I'm afraid because I'll be ostracized. So what do you tell them? I mean, you're the perfect guy to address these issues. What do you tell them?
So going back to regret, I think you would potentially regret never doing anything. So that's one call to action. And there are, any friends that you lose, you also gain many once you start to speak out. And I've seen this too, where there's many people in Silicon Valley that have never said anything in public about this, but are very much on the same page, and even very powerful people in Silicon Valley. And so it does sometimes pay off to take a stance, and I feel like you'll just feel better about yourself. At least I do if I keep my integrity.
Yeah, that's wonderfully said. I've actually heard, again, I can't share the sources for obvious reasons, but I've heard that there are many people at Google, and I know this from very, very trustworthy sources, who certainly very senior people who despise the political correctness and all that social justice warrior stuff. The problem is that the layers below, the folks in the trenches, are the ones who are driving the social justice warrior train. And in that sense, it sort of paralyzes the more senior folks from speaking out, because sort of the larger army is very much been infected with the SJW. Is that your general feeling of how the ecosystem is within Google and high tech in general?
So it's definitely hard to tell what the senior people actually think, at least from my perspective. There's almost surely some that are sick of this. I think Sergey actually is probably sick of some of this political correctness stuff. But I wouldn't even necessarily say that there is this large army of social justice warriors, because they only need a few, just very vocal ones, that will keep pushing this agenda. And when I saw in my case, there were 5 people that did the majority of all the messaging and negative smearing towards me. And those were the same people that were on Twitter and probably leaked the document. So there's a lot of people that are just silently annoyed with all of this.
I'm actually glad that you corrected me in that it doesn't really take a large army, because I've actually made the exact same point that you've made in the context of the university ecosystem. When people ask me, well, is everybody walking around on campus doing this lunacy stuff? And my response is actually the one that you just gave, which is no. Most of the people just want to go about their business studying Shakespeare and computational biology and neuroscience and psychology and marketing. But there's a few folks who are incredibly committed, very much activist, very loud, who then sort of parasitize the space. But it's as little, in your case, it was as few as 5 openly hostile people. That's what it took to hijack your life.
Well, and they seem to be driving it. And there was definitely another big influencer were the high-level managers that ended up sending these negative messages about me, which ended up empowering their employees to also say similar negative things and even directly harass me.
Wow. Uh, let's play a couple of hypothetical games. Suppose tomorrow Google came out and said, "We are deeply sorry for the manner in which we've behaved. Please, Mr. Damore, come back. We recognize our errors. We'll give you a promotion." Would you go back?
I might, simply because I mean I do think that Google is, one of the biggest companies and most powerful companies, and I think changing them or fixing them in some ways would be a huge impact. And I still do like a lot of aspects of Google. It was just this one aspect of the culture that I felt needed to be changed.
Are you in touch still with people at Google? I mean, privately, have you maintained relationships? Have you discussed this off the record with people at Google? And if yes, what's been their response to you? Not officially, unofficially.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I've definitely discussed it with people. Uh, and most of the people that I've discussed it with agree with me, but that's just a biased sample because
Yeah.
those were the people that I would associate with already, and also anyone that disagreed with it strongly probably wouldn't be talking to me anymore. So
Now, I remember when we first connected, before you started going out at media and so on. But by the way, one of the great things, maybe great, but also very onerous things about the position that I'm in, is that I've sort of become the central repository of all the lunacy that happens. So as soon as something bad happens anywhere, I'm almost the first to hear about it because somebody somewhere is sending me either a screenshot that they took or a clandestine taping that they did with some crazy professor. And I say it's wonderful in that I'm sort of always ahead of the story, but it's onerous in that there's so much time that I have a busy life as a professor, and so it ends up being difficult both fighting all these things and having a busy career. I can't
yeah,
remember. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. What were we gonna say? Yeah, so I was gonna say.
no, yeah, I can definitely imagine.
Yeah, so I was gonna say so. But when I received the story about you, where someone said, "Oh, you gotta connect with this guy," and then I reached out to you in early August. Uh, One of the things that I thought was, and maybe it was wrong of me to be presumptuous, and I think I'd asked you that in the email, is, oh, geez, I hope that he didn't. I mean, I hope that he didn't come to my talk, listen to me, and that emboldened him. And then
Oh,
you had cleared it for me in that while you were very aware of my work, that I think you weren't in attendance. Is that correct? Is that the story?
yeah, I had planned to go, but I was actually in China during that time, so I couldn't.
Okay, got it. So I can go to bed at night feeling not guilty about having ruined in any way your life. It had nothing to do with me.
Right.
So what's going on now? What are you just been completely consumed and busy with dealing with this story? So that's sort of become your quote full-time job, or are you setting up something new? Are you looking where are you in your professional trajectory right now?
Yeah, I'm still trying to decide what I want to do. I've been still reading up on a lot of things, trying to, be able to articulate my thoughts on, both gender, diversity, workplace dynamics, and just things in general, because I don't want that to be my only thing that I ever talk about.
So,
But
have you ever thought about going back and now I'm speaking like a professor who wants students to finish what they started. Have you ever thought back that, oh, maybe this is the time for me to go back? I think you were at Harvard, right?
yeah,
So going back to Harvard and wrapping up that PhD.
maybe. One aspect of the PhD that I didn't like so much was just the fact that you have to concentrate so much on a little aspect rather than diversifying your interests.
Right. It's interesting that you say this because I gave a talk back, I think, in 2008 at the University of Arizona, where I talked about which strategy should sort of young assistant professors take up, and they're as they start off their scientific career, should they be very, very focused on a small problem but dig very deeply into it so they become sort of the recognized experts, or should they be more broad thinkers, traverse many intellectual landscapes and so on? And so I exactly addressed that concern of yours, and my sort of prescription for that in that talk was, while the fields are exactly as you correctly pointed out, which is you are rewarded for being a very deep specialist in a narrow field, that I thought that life was too short to only traverse one intellectual landscape, and I use the analogy that rather than sort of going to Jamaica every year, even though we may love Jamaica and have fun there, I want to visit the whole world. And so I always walk that fine line when I'm trying to advise my students, because on the one hand, I recognize what the fields reward, and it is exactly what you didn't like about your PhD. But I also tell them, look, you also have to have fun. You also have to have passion. In my case, for example, I very much lived the second path, which is to be broad. I've published in medicine and economics and psychology and business and consumer behavior, because I don't care. I just go where the interesting problems are. You'll even see, in all the other activities that I do, having this show, this is not typical of a professor to do, right? Many of the professors are like, well, why are you doing this? You should be just doing, lab stuff with hormones, right? But again, it comes from sort of being a true polymath. So you don't think you could maybe go back and, notwithstanding the general, restrictions in academia of being more narrow, look for some interdisciplinary project that might cater to your desire to be more of a broad thinker?
Possibly. I guess I also not sure what exactly I would do with a PhD besides become a professor. Like, it doesn't seem to be strictly required for anything except academia.
Right. And you have no interest in going to academia.
Yeah, I mean, academia could be fun, but I don't know.
So what are some of
It's
the...
very hard to get into.
It is very hard to get into. You're absolutely right. It just as for folks who are listening, one of the great things about being at a business school is that of all of the different areas, the business school academic market remains, much hotter than many other fields. So, if you're graduating with a PhD in physics, then you have to do 1, 2, maybe 3 postdocs before you could ever hope to aspire to have an assistant professorship. And if not, you're maybe driving a cab. Whereas in the business school, because of the market realities, the demands for, not only do you typically can get your PhD and go straight into an assistant professorship, but the salaries are astronomically higher than in other fields. So, for example, if I were in a behavioral biology department, or of course in the psychology department, doing the exact same thing that I'm doing, I'd probably be making half the salary. But simply by being housed in a business school, suddenly it becomes a lot more glitzy and you make a lot more money. So for anybody who's listening, there are ways for one to still make it in academia and hopefully make a lot of money. And of course, you have an open invitation to apply to be my doctoral student anytime, James. So what are some other things that you're looking at in terms of your future career? So academia looks out, PhD probably not. So what are some other things that you're toying with, if you feel comfortable sharing some of these?
Yeah, I mean, I do like thinking about a variety of topics, and I feel like I have sort of an audience at this point, so somehow I can monetize that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So sort of go the Patreon route, set up a channel, so this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I
Well, go ahead.
it's definitely out of my current comfort zone, but
So
it may be fun to pursue at least.
do you feel that from the first, I mean, I guess you probably have done hundreds of these at this point. So this started about 3 months ago. Do you feel that you've become more comfortable doing these, or because you seem somewhat you're a bit restrained, right? You're a bit, maybe, I'm guessing, a bit shy, maybe a bit introverted. Is that right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
has this journey in the past 3 months, sort of, yes, it got you out of your comfort zone, but has it helped you, or do you still have the same sort of obstacles that come with being a bit less extroverted?
I think it's definitely helped, and I feel like I've improved in these interviews, uh, but I probably still don't necessarily have, the urge to just go out and broadcast my thoughts as much as someone else might. And
Because of
so
your
that,
personality, not because you're concerned
right.
about okay. Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I mean, for me, this medium perfectly fits with my personality, because I'm someone who's just, if I may say, very extroverted, very open, love to talk to tons of people, and so I'm always amazed that some of my academic colleagues haven't taken advantage of these tools that we now have available to, to advertise our thoughts, as you said. But then, of course, it's because I'm not really putting myself in their shoes, which is, it
Yeah.
does take a unique personality type. I mean, it's beyond just being intelligent or not, or having interesting things to say or not. It's, do you have the right personality to actually be standing in front of tons of people? Do you face the same reticence if you were doing, say, public speaking? If you were giving a talk at Google, would you have felt the same type of reticence?
Uh, I I sort of got through my fear of public speaking while I was in grad school and while working. So it's I enjoy doing it when it's something that I know a lot about, because that's, just sharing your knowledge, and then people get to engage you with your intellectual interests. But it's still, I guess, difficult to prepare. And I've been invited to give some speeches, and that's difficult.
Because you don't know, uh, if someone's going to ask you a question that might be outside what you consider your tight areas of knowledge. Is that what concerns you?
I actually like the Q&A session,
Okay.
but just the monologue that I would have to give during the speech, that aspect I don't like as much. I just don't like speaking for just myself for an extended period of time.
Right. Which might explain why I probably have spoken a lot more than you in this chat. But I gotta fill in the airtime. Uh, okay, so I guess, do we want to talk? Do we want to revisit at all some of the contents? Because you ultimately do have someone who's dedicated his life, his scientific career, to studying all of these
Mm.
evolutionary things. Do you think it's worthwhile for us to cover some of these issues, or has it been covered so much to death at this point after 3 months that you don't want to talk about it? I leave it up to you to decide whether it's worth our while to cover it or not.
I think going through some of the evolutionary psychology perspective would be useful.
Okay. So where do you lead? You lead the conversation. Where do you want to go? Ask me some questions, and I'll see if I can elucidate some points. Because I read your memo when it first came out, and I didn't see anything that was glaringly wrong. By the way, I should mention that uh, in the clip that I released earlier today, which was, as I said, a clip that I had originally taped in early August, I had said that you had not provided any citations, and then someone corrected me and said, "Oh, you must have then seen a memo where the citations were removed." And that's exactly what must have
Yeah.
happened. And so I apologize for that, because that person corrected me and said, "No, no, no, it was very well cited." So I'm glad to hear that. But so yeah, so take it away. What do you wanna talk about in terms of these substantive issues?
Mm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess uh, I mean some of the not only the gender differences, but also just the different political orientations. I think it's kind of interesting to think about why those have evolved.
Right.
And some aspect of it is, xenophobia versus xenophilia, and there are different reasons why you would want to be xenophobic versus xenophilic, and some of that could be, germ. You don't want to interact with other people simply because they might have diseases, like what happened with Columbus and the Native Americans. And but also getting new genes into the gene pool can also be um, advantageous. And I've read that people in more tropical climates actually end up being more conservative, so more xenophobic in this way, because, or just liking similar people, I guess, because there's more diseases.
Right.
And so it's more likely that someone that you meet will have a disease and they won't necessarily have the genes to protect themselves against the diseases in the area.
So that's a great point. As a matter of fact, I had written a grant, a governmental grant, a research grant, several years ago, which I had won, but then didn't get the money because the government had run out of money. And so they said that I could put on my CV that I had won the grant, but it did me no pragmatic value because I didn't get the money. And a central feature of that grant actually dealt precisely with the pathogenic model that you speak of. In my case, I was looking at applying these ideas to a consumer setting because as someone who studies consumer psychology and consumption in general, I thought that in the same way that, for example, this is not my own research, it's someone else's, in the same way that the distribution of spicy cuisines, meaning how much spice you use in your cuisine, turns out to be beautifully correlated with pathogenic density in different ecosystems, and that pathogenic density is very much related to ambient temperature. Hotter climates have a greater proliferation of food pathogens, and therefore you have the cultural adaptation of having spices or pickling or smoking foods, all of which are cultural adaptations to a biological problem. But you're exactly right that pathogenic model has been used not only in something that seems reasonably related like cuisine, but for things like you said, individualism versus collectivism, right? Some societies are individualist, Canada, US, Britain. Other societies are collectivist, Arab society, Far East. And it turns out that how a country scores on collectivism versus individualism relates to pathogenic density within the environment, very much related to that what you talked about, the transfer of diseases and so on. So there's, I think, real promise to take this idea of pathogenic density in different ecosystems and apply it. In your case, you're talking about political orientation. It could be cultural values. It could be cuisines. I'd like to apply it in consumer behavior. So, for example, one of the hypotheses I have is that in environments where there is greater pathogenic density, then males will have a greater penchant to want to engage in vigorous, feverish sexual signaling because I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow. So, for example, how much I engage in conspicuous consumption should be correlated across cultures to pathogenic density. So I really like that idea. So what have you found in your, is it you just looked at the literature to see if there's a link between pathogenic density and political orientation, or are you doing some of your own research, or where are you in that process?
Yeah, I've just read this, and it seems to, multiple sources seem to say the same thing. So that's one aspect of evolutionary psychology, perhaps influencing political behavior.
Can I offer? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And I guess there's, also the links between, egalitarian and hierarchical end up, playing out in multiple areas of life. How, the mother will want to be very egalitarian with the children, but the, father might really try to reward hierarchy, and the parents themselves want this hierarchy, but the children will naturally revolt against it.
Right.
And that's one reason perhaps why young people tend to be more progressive, and just open to multiple experiences. They're trying to find their niche in the world, and they naturally want to revolt against the existing establishment.
Right.
Right.
Beautiful. There is a similar theory to what you just said, which actually I talked about in the Q&A, at my Google talk that looks at the effects of birth order on on all sorts of things. One of which is the argument that the further down you are in sipship, so if you are last born, for example, then you will score higher on openness to new experiences. This is not my theory. This is Frank Sulloway's theory. Precisely because you use the word niche, and he argues that when a child is born, let's say you're firstborn, then your goal is always to maximize or procure the most amount of parental investment that you can. Now, the way you do it in the human context, he argues, is that you have to occupy a unique niche in your parents' eyes. Now, when you're firstborn, all the niches are unoccupied. I could be the good boy niche, I could be the rebel niche, I could be any niche. I could fill any niche I want. As you go down the sip ship, you're fourth, in the sip ship, then there are fewer and fewer, unoccupied niches available to you, and that original adaptive problem forces you to think outside the box, to be more open to experiences. And he shows through his work that later born score higher on openness to experience in the big five. And he also shows that most of the radical scientific innovations are typically espoused by later borns and are fought against by firstborns, who are the protectors of the orthodoxy. So there's a lot of beautiful stuff there. But the idea of linking politics to evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theory in general occurs at many different levels. We talked about at, say, the cultural level with pathogens, but even at the individual level, why is one guy more into staunch military interventions as a political orientation, whereas another one is more of a pacifist? And there is research that shows, published in one of the top journals, that shows that just your physical strength is a predictor of individual differences, right? And so guys who are physically stronger are more likely to espouse a sort of vigorous military interventionist outlook. So there's a whole field called biopolitics and evolutionary politics that exactly does that. And more generally, everything is ultimately ripe for the incorporation of evolutionary theory. As I tell people, there is no human endeavor that involves biological agents called humans that somehow exists where you leave your biological heritage at the door. So the idea, for example, that things that are happening at Google, whether it be employee to employee rivalry, whether it be who gets the top window office to demonstrate dominance hierarchy, you don't suddenly stop being a biological being because you entered Mountain View at Google. And so it is amazing to me that people would have responded in the way that they did to your memo. Now, of course, I can ask you why you think that is, but I think we both know that what it is. It's because there's a hopeful message to actually not be believing in evolutionary psychology, right? We're all born with equal potentiality. There is no innate sex differences and so on. Is that the main reason you think that caused the massive backlash against you?
Right. I saw so my document was just a Google Doc, and so people were commenting, and I was addressing the comments, sometimes changing the document, and there was sometimes a common thread of very egalitarian, equal outcome type of idea, and if we just changed how we treated people, then everything would be the same, and which leads you to basically communism.
Exactly.
And so there was definitely that thread going through a lot of this.
Yeah, it's almost. As an evolutionary psychologist, I have received, different sources of detractors, very different. Postmodernists will hate evolutionary psychology because they believe that there are no universal truths, and evolutionary psychology does look at universal truths. Boom, therefore you have a problem. Radical feminists will hate evolutionary theories for their reasons. Social constructivists will hate it. But you're exactly right that there is sort of, I like to call it a hopeful ethos. So a lot of these folks are holding these ideological positions which become akin to quasi-religions because not that I wish to defend them, because frankly they're enemies of reason, but they're holding these positions from what they consider to be a noble place, right? If
Right.
there's a way for us to socially engineer things, then we can eradicate the inequalities that exist. Like, for example, and usually when I provide this example, all these morons kind of dissipate into thin air. Let's look at the winners of the 100 meters since 1984. Let's look at the Boston marathon winners for the past 25, 30 years. I don't really see equality of outcome. I actually see some extraordinarily recurring patterns. Why aren't you worried about that diversity, right? So it's really a laughable position that they hold, but I think it's really coming from a good place. So should we be feeling sorry for them because they're wrong? They're wrong, but they're doing it for some noble reason?
I mean, I feel like most people are noble and are good, and so yeah, I don't know that they're any nobler than other people in general, but they may be more closed off to ideas that run against their ideology. Although I feel like everyone tends to have some sort of ideology that they hold sacred.
Well, so let me address this, and I'll be less charitable toward them than you just were. I think there's a hierarchy of objectives for a life well lived. And the highest ideal that we should ascribe to, as I've said in other venues, is truth. So, in other words, truth is the thing that guides me. So, if I am a tribalist, I'm a tribalist in the camp of truth. I seek to always belong in the camp of truth. If I held some ideology that was contrary to what comes out as the evidence is against my ideology, then if I'm an honest person, an intellectually honest person, then I have to revise my opinions. So no, I don't think we're all equally noble. I think people who are driven by truth are actually much more noble than people who are driven by ideology. And the reason I say this is because, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot for my next book, because people say, well, how do we get through this? Well, I say, don't be a tribalist. Don't believe in ideologies. Always think, what is the evidence that allows me to belong to the camp of truth? And ultimately, even though scientists are not perfect creatures, the reason why I love science is because if you're an honest scientist, then all your knowledge is always provisional. It's what we know until someone comes along and maybe falsifies it. And if they falsify it, and if I'm honest, then I have to revise my opinions. That's the difference between science and ideology. So the guys at Google that cause you the trouble, they're not noble, because they say, I don't care what information you provide me. I don't care if SAAD now comes in and gives me 17,000 references that show that I'm a bullshitter. I will hang on to my ideology no matter what. So they're dishonest and hence not noble. What do you think of that? Am I too rough?
Yeah, I guess I feel like, I do too very much value truth, but sometimes that also comes with maybe devaluing emotions and, some of these deeper desires that humans do tend to have. And part of that, at least for me, is just, I've learned to try to stay steady, but, different people have a different experience. And so, and I noticed this myself, where I sort of just underestimated the emotional response to my document. And so even if it was, true, it was offensive to some people, apparently. And so I guess, as much as I would like to say that, truth is the one true thing, I guess pragmatically, that definition sometimes needs to be expanded to include more of the human experience.
So what you're
sometimes.
So does that mean, let's suppose so in hindsight, you now have some information like the emotional response that people had, that you were not predicting, you were not estimating. If you knew then what you know now, is it that you might have not written the memo, or would you have written it in a different way that would have taken into account their emotion? So, for example, when you said, I wouldn't have used the word neuroticism, is that what you would have done? So you would have still gone with the course, but just packaged it in a way that incorporates their likely emotional response?
Yeah, I definitely would have tried to make it more palatable to other people. Although, then again, it's hard to regret even that, because I feel like some of the media outrage was some of like part of the reason why it became so big. And so if it was just this really thing that didn't create any controversy, then I wouldn't be speaking to you right now, maybe.
Right, right. Well, I guess all I could tell you is that I'm truly delighted to have finally had a chance to meet you, because I think that if everyone did what you did in their own small way, right? Again, it doesn't have to be the way you were catapulted into the public conscience, but if everybody had a commitment to say, if I see something that doesn't pass my sniff test, I am going to intervene politely. I mean, I can't imagine someone having written a more tepid, nicely toned, I need to learn how to be as diplomatic as you are, because sometimes when I'm pissed, I go after you hard, because I actually get offended by injuries to truth, and I take it as a
Right.
personal affront. And so, to me, I mean, for everybody who's watching this, and I hope many people end up watching our chat, and I apologize for having spoken more than James, but I think what people should take away is that, everybody has a stake in this battle. And, I think earlier you said, well, I don't know what will be the ultimate downstream consequences, the pros and cons. I can't imagine that the end result, the accounting of the story, won't come out in your favor. Because ultimately, we all want to be doing something that's meaningful. And I'm sure that whatever it is that you were doing at Google was exceptionally meaningful. But I'm willing to bet, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as meaningful as you having taken the principled positions that you just did, because you were defending the truth. And that's the highest ideal. And so I tip my hat to you, James.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, at least for some people that have personally contacted me, I've had a very positive influence on their life, and I sort of red pilled them in that I showed them that there is just another aspect of reality in some ways that they're missing, and just showed them how you can't really trust the media and their portrayals of these things, and just how controversial some of these topics have become, and how dangerous really that is. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, just gonna say that, I hope at least that I provided some value through that.
Oh, I'm sure you have. Now, do you have a sense of the typical, I mean, not that you did a sort of demographic study, but just from sort of the people that have reached out to you, is there a sense of a demographic? Is it sort of the young male who works in high tech, or is it a very broad demographic? It's the elderly grandmother who, within her own milieu, is also facing thought policing. What's the general demographic of the folks who've reached out to you and stated that you've helped them gain courage?
Mm-hmm. So I think, so if you look at the political spectrum of left and right, and then authoritarian and libertarian, the authoritarian left, those are the people that most hate me. But then most, or a lot of the people outside of that, seem to like what I say. And so
you've got 3 out of the 4 quadrants.
Yeah. And yeah, so gender isn't necessarily, the predictive factor. There are many women that support me. And I guess sometimes conservatives will support me for a different reason than a libertarian would support me, but there's still some support there.
That's wonderful. Is there? Have you thought about the possibility of writing a book based on your experiences?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about it. I guess there's just some self-doubt in thinking about like, would people actually want to read this? So I guess, I mean, I do seem to have a lot of followers. I still don't fully understand why people seem to like it so much, but
Well, I think it's because I mean I think you're very modest, but I think it's because it took great courage, right? Whether I mean, why is it that we find fire people? We shouldn't say firemen, fire persons. Why do we find them so appealing? By the way, there's a study that shows that if you take a guy and either have him approach a woman wearing a fireman suit or not, the likelihood of her, I think, giving him her phone number increases drastically if he's wearing a fireman suit. Why is it that the fireman suit is so intoxicating? Is it because it's a amplified signal of courage, right? This guy is going to walk into a building to save a kitten, a baby, a puppy, an elderly person. And therefore, the reason why I think people follow you is because you walked a costly signal, to use evolutionary theory, right? You know, you didn't do 3 jumping jacks to prove that you're courageous. You lost your job at Google, a very, very attractive job at a top company, to defend your beliefs. And whether people want to admit it or not, that's very attractive. And so it's not surprising or mysterious in the least bit to me that you'd have a large following. I would expect nothing less than that.
yeah, although I guess the cynical look of that would be they want to associate with me because they think that I will do a sacrifice. Like if they're in their house on fire, then I would go in and save them.
Right.
And I mean, obviously, that's not what people are consciously thinking, but maybe that's the
Right.
underlying evolutionary psychology reason.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, I think there are several things. Also, the fact that you're young, right? I don't. I mean, I'm sure that the demographic groups that are supporting you is broad and varied, but I do think that the fact that you're a young person, you probably attract a lot of young people who are facing similar things, whether it be at work, whether it be with their friends, whether it be at the university, certainly. And so it becomes easy. You know, here's forgive me for saying, an average guy who rose above it, who took on Google. Geez, what more of a David Goliath story do you want more than that? So I think at some point you become sort of an archetype. You become, you know, this is a guy who did the impossible. He had the guts. He had the testicular fortitude to stand up and be principled. I think that's wonderful. So you don't have to be so modest, man. Bask in the glory. Did you check your testosterone before you released the memo and after? Because I'm expecting that there would have been a massive endocrinological response in your T levels.
Yeah, uh, I think there were definitely lows and highs after the memo. So, you know, there were some very stressful moments, but then, you know, seeing the support also really helped.
Right.
And, you know, I've also been looking more into, you know, these gender differences in relationships and how actually men and women tend to deal with stress differently.
Right.
And testosterone actually helps men reduce their stress. And, you know, what gives men testosterone is, you know, conquering or getting admiration from others. And so the support definitely helps, I think. Otherwise, I would have just been a nervous wreck, maybe.
Well, another thing that would have been interesting to measure, since we're talking about endocrinological responses, is your cortisol level. I suspect that as the sort of the reality unfolded, you would have had a huge spike of cortisol because of all the stress response. And I suspect that by now that's sort of tapered off as you habituate to this reality. And now testosterone is kicking up and it's only going up. I had actually one of my graduate students and I recently finished a project. He defended his thesis earlier this year, where we looked at extreme sports and testosterone levels. And I think you could imagine where we're going with this. Our original goal was to do base jumpers. Are you familiar? Do you know what base jumping is?
like bungee jumping sort
No,
of?
it's not bungee. It's
Or
actually much more dangerous. Base jumpers. It's an acronym. Building, antenna. I can't remember the other two. You jump off fixed places with a parachute, but it's a fast deploying parachute because it's not very high. It's I don't know. It's 100 stories high. It's 200
oh
meters high. And when you jump off, you basically have a very short window a free fall, and then you have to deploy the parachute. If you miss that, then it's too late and you're going to splatter all over the place, right? So it's the really the sort of the ultimate extreme sport. And so we wanted to look at a whole bunch of endocrinological phenomena related to this behavior. Originally our goal was to run the study at a place called on a day called Bridge Day, which I think is in West Virginia, where there's this very sort of scary looking suspension bridge where all these base jumpers congregate once a year and then jump off. And then the organizers of the event at the last minute pulled their their clearance for us to do it. So we ended up doing skydivers. And frankly, the results, although we got a few interesting results, but generally speaking, our results were quite disappointing. And we think, as I had sort of warned my student, that we didn't get the effects because skydiving is actually not a very dangerous thing, right? I mean, you have 90-year-old folks who, to celebrate their 90th birthday, will go on a tandem jump. So although it seems very, ominous and scary, it's actually quite safe. And so the ideal study would be to sort of replicate this again, but do base jumpers. And so again, from your perspective, you were the ultimate base jumper because you took on Google. You weren't in some obscure little corner. And I think that's why eventually you were catapulted to such fame because you jumped off the Google building and survived, right?
yeah, I guess. And the cortisol levels were definitely high enough that I was losing a ton of sleep and not really eating much.
Wow.
So it's bad.
I was gonna make a joke. If only I could experience such stress, so I could not eat so much and lose weight. I think my physician, apparently I'm not nearly stressed enough because I can't seem to lose any weight. Are there any projects that you're currently working on that you would love to promote using this forum that you'd feel comfortable talking about or not? I'd like to give you this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm still exploring like how best to continue doing some of the just, thinking in public type stuff. I'm not sure Twitter is necessarily the best forum because I do appreciate that it forces you to condense your thoughts into 140 characters. But for some of the things that I want to talk about, nuance is very important. And that's often lacking on Twitter. So I'm still exploring. I mean, I'm thinking about, doing YouTube stuff. I'm not sure. And, I'm also just thinking about going back to work for something because as much as I'm introverted, I do enjoy, having structured social environments, which, working for a big company does have, where you interact with the same group of people every day. And that was fulfilling for me, which I'm missing now.
Would you, if you went back that route, sort of going to work for a company, do you think that you would want to continue in the high-tech industry, or Procter and Gamble may reach out to you for whatever reason and decide that you've got the right profile, and if the job were interesting, you'd go in that industry, or are you very much focused on the high-tech industry?
So I do like tech simply because I feel like that is what the future is. And that's partly why I joined Google, because I felt like Google will become the biggest company and will pretty much create the singularity,
Right.
But so it would be difficult to, do a conventional manufacturing company or something. But I would definitely be open to something that's not just coding, something higher level maybe.
Right. Well, best of luck. Real pleasure talking to you. We're almost at an hour. Stay on the line just so we could talk a bit offline. Probably this chat will be up later today, if not tomorrow. And of course, I'll tag you on Twitter when it's ready. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we finally had this conversation, James.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers. All right.